Sometimes a man stands alone against the world, carrying burdens no soul should bear. Jacob Bear McKenna had lived 40 years in the mountains, where loneliness was his only companion and survival his daily prayer. Now he sat in chains in Cedar Ridge's makeshift courtroom, facing townspeople hungry for justice after his fight with the notorious Dalton gang. The saloon was packed with folks who'd already made up their minds about his guilt. Judge Morrison raised his gavel, ready to deliver what everyone expected would be a death sentence. Then the doors swung open. A woman in expensive silk dress walked in, like she belonged there, her voice steady and sure. "Your Honor, you cannot sentence my husband without hearing from his wife." The courtroom fell silent. Nobody knew who this elegant stranger was, or why she'd claimed such a wild mountain man. But who was she really, and what secret connected her to Bear McKenna? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of those iron shackles had become familiar to Jacob McKenna over the past 3 days. But they felt heavier now under the stares of Cedar Ridge's entire population. Every soul in town seemed crammed into Murphy's saloon, transformed into a makeshift courthouse for want of any proper legal building. The smell of sawdust, whiskey, and unwashed bodies hung thick in the air, mixing with the tension that crackled like lightning before a storm. Bear had known this day would come eventually. A man couldn't live 40 years in the Colorado Territory, surviving by his wits and his rifle without making enemies. He'd always figured he'd die alone in those mountains, maybe taken down by a grizzly or claimed by the bitter winter cold. He'd never imagined it would end like this, chained to a chair while townspeople he barely knew decided whether he'd see another sunset. The mountains had been his sanctuary since he'd returned from the war 20 years ago. Up there, among the peaks that scraped the belly of the sky, a man could find peace if he looked hard enough. Bear had built his cabin with his own 2 hands, choosing a spot where the morning sun painted the valley gold and the evening light turned the snow-capped ridges purple. He'd learned to read the weather in the clouds, to track game by the faintest sign, to survive months of isolation with nothing but his thoughts for company. Those thoughts had been dark companions at first. The war had left scars deeper than the bayonet wound across his ribs or the musket ball that had shattered his left shoulder. He'd seen good men die for causes they barely understood, had held boys not much older than children as they bled out in muddy fields far from home. When the fighting ended, Bear couldn't stomach the idea of returning to civilization, to pretending that life could go back to normal after such horrors. So he'd gone up into the high country, where the only sounds were wind through the pines and the distant call of eagles. He'd taught himself to trap and hunt, to preserve meat and cure hides, to find medicinal plants his Cherokee grandmother had shown him as a boy. Slowly, year by year, the mountain silence had begun to heal something in him that army surgeons never could have reached. He'd made a good living as a guide and trapper, leading hunting parties for wealthy Eastern gentlemen who wanted to bag a trophy elk or bear. They'd pay handsomely for his services, though most of them looked at him like he was some kind of exotic creature himself. This tall, broad-shouldered man with hair gone prematurely grey and eyes that held too many memories. He spoke little on those trips, just enough to keep his clients alive and successful. They seemed to prefer it that way, telling stories around the campfire while he sat apart, listening to the night sounds and thinking his own thoughts. The isolation suited him. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, even protective of it. When winter locked the high passes, he might go 4 months without seeing another human soul. Those were the times he valued most, when the world shrunk down to just him and his cabin, and the endless white silence of the mountains. But even mountain hermits had to come to town occasionally for supplies: coffee, ammunition, salt, the few manufactured goods he couldn't make or do without. That's how he'd first encountered the Dalton gang, 3 brothers and their assorted hangers-on who'd been terrorizing the territory for the better part of 2 years. Cedar Ridge itself was a typical frontier settlement, born of optimism and desperation in equal measure. The discovery of silver in the nearby hills had drawn prospectors, merchants, saloon keepers, and all the other folks who followed mining booms like vultures followed death. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with hastily built wooden structures that housed a general store. 2 saloons, a hotel, a barbershop that doubled as the town's medical facility, and a handful of other businesses essential to frontier life. The people were a mix of hopeful families seeking new starts, single men chasing fortune, and the usual collection of drifters, gamblers, and opportunists that frontier towns attracted. Most were decent enough folks, working hard to build something permanent out of raw wilderness. They deserved better than having their lives disrupted by outlaws who took what they pleased and killed anyone who objected. Judge Morrison was one of the good ones. Harrison Morrison had come west from Illinois with a law degree and genuine desire to bring civilization to the frontier. He was a small, neat man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a carefully maintained mustache that gave him an air of dignity even in these rough surroundings. Bear had encountered him a few times over the years and found him to be fair-minded and incorruptible, qualities that made him valuable in a place where law often came down to whoever had the fastest gun. The judge's wife, Martha, had died of pneumonia their second winter in Cedar Ridge, leaving him alone with his books and his principles. He'd thrown himself into his work, riding circuit between settlements, trying to establish some semblance of legal order in a land where might too often made right. He treated everyone who appeared before his bench with the same careful attention, whether they were prominent merchants or common drifters. Sheriff Tom Bradley was another matter entirely. A thick-set man with mean eyes and hands that were too quick to reach for his gun. Bradley had been bought and paid for by various interests since the day he'd pinned on the badge. He managed to look the other way when the Dalton gang rode through town, always finding urgent business elsewhere when honest folk needed protection. Bear suspected Bradley got a cut of whatever the gang stole, but proving it was another matter entirely. The Dalton brothers, Eli, Samuel and young Jesse, had started small, robbing lone travelers and isolated homesteads. But success had made them bolder and more vicious. They'd graduated to holding up supply wagons and threatening established businesses for protection money. Word was, they had ambitions of controlling all the criminal activity in the territory, and they weren't particular about who got hurt in the process. Bear had managed to avoid them for the most part, sticking to the high country where they rarely ventured. But a man couldn't live completely apart from the world, and eventually their paths had to cross. Now, as he sat in those heavy shackles, listening to the murmur of voices around him, Bear reflected on how quickly a life could change. 3 days ago, he'd been checking his trap lines, enjoying the crisp morning air and the sight of fresh snow on the distant peaks. Today, he was facing a rope, and all because he'd tried to do the right thing. The woman who'd burst through those doors was unlike anyone he'd ever seen in Cedar Ridge. Even in his current circumstances, Bear couldn't help but notice the quality of her clothing. That silk dress probably cost more than most folks in town made in a year. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of professional attention, and those pearls around her neck caught the lamplight like captured starlight, but it was her bearing that truly set her apart. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. Everything about her suggested wealth, refinement, and social position, exactly the opposite of everything Bear represented. Yet here she was, claiming to be his wife. Bear studied her face, trying to find some memory that would explain her presence. She was beautiful in a way that would be hard to forget. High cheekbones, expressive dark eyes, a mouth that suggested both intelligence and determination. But he was certain he'd never seen her before in his life. The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence after her declaration. Even Judge Morrison seemed at a loss for words, his gavel frozen halfway to the bench. Sheriff Bradley's face had gone red with confusion and anger, while the townspeople whispered among themselves like leaves rustling in the wind. The woman, this mysterious stranger who claimed to be Victoria McKenna, stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her chin raised and her hands folded calmly before her. She showed no sign of nervousness or uncertainty, as if claiming to be married to a mountain man facing murder charges was the most natural thing in the world. Bear found himself oddly moved by her intervention, even as it bewildered him. No one had ever stood up for him before, not since his army days when soldiers looked out for each other as a matter of survival. He'd grown accustomed to fighting his own battles, to depending only on himself in a world that had shown him little kindness. But here was this elegant stranger, risking her own reputation and possibly her safety to help a man she didn't even know. The gesture touched something in him that he'd thought dead and buried long ago, a capacity for hope, for believing that maybe he wasn't as alone in the world as he'd always assumed, whatever her reasons. Whatever game she was playing, Bear found himself grateful for her presence. For the first time in 3 days, the weight of those shackles didn't seem quite so heavy. The trouble had started 3 days earlier on the mountain road between Cedar Ridge and Silverton. Bear had been returning from his monthly supply run, his pack horse loaded with coffee, salt, and ammunition, when he'd heard the gunshots echoing off the canyon walls. His first instinct was to mind his own business. A man lived longer in the territory by staying out of other people's troubles. But then he'd heard a woman scream. Bear had reined in his horse and listened carefully. The sounds were coming from around the next bend in the road, where the trail narrowed between 2 steep rock faces. More shots, men's voices shouting orders, another terrified cry from what sounded like a young woman. His weathered hunting knife felt heavy in its sheath as he made his decision. He'd left his horses tied in a grove of aspens and worked his way forward on foot, using skills learned from his Cherokee grandmother and perfected during the war. The knife was an old friend, its blade worn smooth from years of use. He'd made it himself during his second winter in the mountains, forging the steel from an old cavalry saber and wrapping the handle with leather from his first bear kill. It had been his constant companion ever since, as much a part of him as his own hands. What he'd found around that bend had made his blood run cold. A fancy carriage sat sideways across the narrow trail, one wheel hanging over the edge of a 50-foot drop. 3 of the Dalton gang had surrounded it. He recognized Samuel and Jesse Dalton, along with a scarred man called Hutchins, who was known for his cruelty even among outlaws. They were terrorizing a middle-aged man in a business suit and his daughter, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. "Please," the man was saying, his voice shaking with fear and rage. "Take whatever you want, but leave my daughter alone." Samuel Dalton, the middle brother and meanest of the 3, just laughed. He was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. "We'll take what we want anyway, old man. Question is whether you get to watch or not." The girl was pressed against the carriage, tears streaming down her face as Hutchins moved closer to her. She reminded Bear of his sister Sarah, who died of fever when she was just 15. The memory hit him like a physical blow, bringing back all the guilt and grief he'd carried for 25 years. Bear had emerged from the rocks like a ghost, the knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Let them be," he'd said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The outlaws had spun around, surprised by his sudden appearance. Samuel's hand moved toward his gun, but Bear was already moving. The knife took Hutchins in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a howl of pain. Bear rolled behind the carriage as Samuel's pistol barked, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. "You made a mistake, mountain man," Jesse Dalton called out. He was the youngest of the brothers, barely 20 but already marked by cruelty. "Should have minded your own business." "Maybe so," Bear had replied, checking the loads in his own revolver. "But I reckon some things are worth the risk." What followed was a brief but vicious gunfight. Bear had the advantage of cover and experience, but the outlaws had numbers and desperation. Hutchins, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to work his way around to the left, while the Dalton brothers kept Bear pinned down with continuous fire. The knife had saved his life again when Hutchins came at him from behind. Bear heard the man's boot scrape on stone and spun around just in time to catch the outlaw's wrist, turning his own blade against him. Hutchins went down hard, his gun clattering over the edge of the cliff. Samuel Dalton made the mistake of trying to use the girl as a shield, grabbing her arm and pressing his pistol to her head. "Drop your gun, mountain man, or she dies." Bear had looked into the girl's terrified eyes and seen his sister's face. Without hesitation, he'd put 2 bullets in Samuel's chest, the shots coming so close together they sounded like one. The outlaw dropped like a stone, his unfired pistol spinning away across the rocky ground. Jesse Dalton, seeing his brother fall, had lost his nerve and fled on horseback, leaving Bear alone with the wounded Hutchins, the grateful family, and one dead outlaw. The girl's father, a merchant named Thompson, had offered to testify on Bear's behalf, but Bear had waved him off. "Get your daughter to safety," he told Thompson. "This country's no place for her." He'd been tying Hutchins' wound when Sheriff Bradley arrived with a posse. The lawman took one look at Samuel Dalton's body and the wounded outlaw, then fixed his mean little eyes on Bear. "Jacob McKenna," Bradley had said, his voice thick with false authority. "You're under arrest for murder." "Murder?" Thompson had protested. "This man saved our lives. Those outlaws were going to kill us both." But Bradley wasn't interested in the merchant's testimony. He'd already made up his mind, probably before he'd even arrived. Bear realized then that the sheriff had likely been in the Daltons' pocket from the beginning. With Samuel dead and Hutchins wounded, Bradley needed someone to blame, someone who couldn't implicate him in the gang's activities. "The way I see it," Bradley had said, "this here mountain man picked a fight with honest travelers and killed one of them in cold blood. That's murder in my book." Bear hadn't resisted when they'd put the shackles on him. He knew the game was rigged, knew that fighting would only make things worse. But as they'd loaded him into the wagon for the ride back to Cedar Ridge, he'd felt something die inside him, the last flickering ember of faith he'd had in justice and human decency. The knife had been taken as evidence, along with his guns and the few personal possessions he'd been carrying. Without it, he felt strangely naked, as if they'd amputated a part of his body. That blade had been with him through everything, his lonely years in the mountains, his encounters with wild animals and dangerous weather, the quiet moments when he'd used it to carve pieces of wood by firelight. Now it sat on the judge's makeshift bench, tagged as evidence in a trial that everyone knew was a sham. The morning sun, streaming through the saloon's dirty windows, caught the worn steel, making it gleam like silver. Bear stared at it, remembering all the times it had saved his life, all the ways it had helped him survive in the wilderness. But survival was a different game in town, where law could be bought and justice was whatever the man with power said it was. Bear had always known that his mountain sanctuary was temporary, that eventually the outside world would intrude on his peace. He just hadn't expected it to end like this, chained in a saloon while corrupt lawmen twisted his act of heroism into grounds for execution. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years avoiding human contact, convinced that people would only bring him pain and disappointment. The one time he'd stepped forward to help, the one moment when he'd let his conscience override his caution, had landed him here facing a hangman's noose as he sat in those heavy shackles, waiting for Judge Morrison to call the court to order. Bear found himself thinking about that knife and all it represented. It was more than just a tool or weapon. It was a symbol of his self-reliance, his ability to survive on his own terms. Without it, he felt diminished, vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. The knife had been forged in the mountains, shaped by his own hands from the remnants of his old life. Now it would be evidence in the trial that might end everything. But somehow, looking at its familiar outline on that makeshift judge's bench, Bear felt a strange kind of peace. He'd done the right thing on that mountain road, regardless of the consequences. He'd saved 2 innocent lives and put down a man who deserved killing. If that was worth dying for, then at least he'd meet his end with a clear conscience. The knife would remember, even if no one else did. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and tapped his gavel against the makeshift bench, though the sound was lost in the murmur of confused voices that filled Murphy's saloon. Every eye in the room was fixed on the elegant woman who stood in the center aisle, her silk dress a splash of deep blue against the rough wooden walls and sawdust floor. "Ma'am," the judge said carefully, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "did you just claim to be married to the defendant?" "I did, Your Honor." Victoria's voice carried clearly through the room, steady and sure despite the hundreds of stares focused on her. "My name is Victoria McKenna, and this man is my lawful husband." Bear felt like he'd been struck by lightning. The name meant nothing to him, but the conviction in her voice was absolute. He studied her face again, searching for any hint of recognition, any buried memory that might explain this impossible claim. She was beautiful, certainly, but in a refined way that belonged in drawing rooms and opera houses, not in frontier saloons or mountain cabins. Sheriff Bradley pushed through the crowd, his face red with indignation. "Judge, this is ridiculous. We've known Jake McKenna for 5 years, and he ain't never mentioned having no wife. That's because we were separated," Victoria replied smoothly, never taking her eyes off the judge. "Jacob left for the territory after our marriage, and I remained in Philadelphia to settle family affairs. I've only recently arrived to rejoin him." The lie came so naturally, so convincingly, that Bear almost believed it himself. But questions tumbled through his mind like stones down a mountainside. Why would this woman, this obvious lady of quality, risk her reputation to help a stranger? What could she possibly gain from claiming marriage to a mountain hermit facing murder charges? Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Mrs. McKenna, you understand this is a court of law. Making false statements under oath is perjury, punishable by imprisonment." "I understand completely, Your Honor." Victoria reached into her small beaded purse and withdrew a folded document. "I have our marriage certificate here, if you'd like to examine it." The paper she handed to the judge looked official enough, heavy stock with an elaborate seal at the bottom. Bear watched Judge Morrison's face as he examined it, seeing the man's confusion deepen. The certificate was dated 4 years earlier, from a church in Philadelphia that Bear had never heard of, much less visited. But as the judge studied the document, Bear noticed something that made his chest tighten. Victoria's hands, which had been so steady when she'd faced down the entire courtroom, were trembling now. The slight tremor was visible only to him from his angle, but it spoke of nerves and fear carefully hidden beneath her composed exterior. Whatever her reasons for this deception, it was costing her something. "Your Honor," Sheriff Bradley protested, "anyone can forge a piece of paper. This whole thing's a sham to delay justice." "Perhaps," Judge Morrison replied, setting the certificate on his bench. "But the law is clear. A man's wife has certain rights regarding his legal proceedings. Mrs. McKenna, assuming that's your real name, what exactly are you requesting?" Victoria straightened her shoulders, and Bear caught a glimpse of steel beneath the silk. "I request time to arrange proper legal representation for my husband, Your Honor, and I invoke my right as his spouse to visit with him privately before these proceedings continue." A rumble of disapproval went through the crowd. Someone called out, "Ain't no mountain hermit got a wife like that." Another voice added, "She's probably one of them actress women from Denver." Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Regardless of my personal doubts about this marriage, I cannot ignore what appears to be a legal document. Mrs. McKenna, you may have 15 minutes with the defendant. Sheriff Bradley, please escort them to your office for privacy." Bradley's face darkened. "Judge, I don't think 15 minutes, Sheriff. That's the law." The walk to Bradley's office felt like a parade of curiosity and suspicion. Townspeople pressed close on both sides, straining to get a better look at the mysterious woman and whispering speculations that ranged from romantic to ridiculous. Bear shuffled along in his shackles, acutely aware of how he must look next to Victoria's obvious refinement. Bradley's office occupied a corner of the general store, separated from the main shopping area by a thin wooden partition. It contained a battered desk, 2 chairs, and a gun rack that held the sheriff's official weapons. The space smelled of tobacco, leather, and unwashed clothes, a sharp contrast to the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow Victoria. 15 minutes, Bradley growled, positioning himself just outside the open door. And I'll be listening to every word. Victoria waited until the sheriff stepped back, then moved close to Bear's chair. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name really is Victoria," she said, her breath warm against his ear. "Victoria Ashworth, I need you to trust me." "Why?" Bear's voice was equally quiet, rusty from 3 days of silence. "What's this about?" "I can't explain everything now, but you saved innocent people on that mountain road. Sheriff Bradley is corrupt, and this whole trial is designed to protect the real criminals." She paused, glancing toward the door. "I have reasons for helping you." "Personal reasons? What reasons?" Victoria's dark eyes met his, and Bear saw pain there, old grief carefully controlled, but never forgotten. "My brother died in the war. A cavalry officer named Thomas Ashworth. Before he died, he wrote about a soldier who saved his life, a man who was supposed to find me after the fighting ended, but never did." Bear felt the world tilt beneath him. Thomas Ashworth. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories he'd buried deep. A young lieutenant, barely 22, dying in a field hospital at Antietam. The boy had grabbed Bear's hand with surprising strength, making him promise to find his sister in Philadelphia, to tell her he'd died thinking of her. Bear had never kept that promise. He'd been wounded himself, shipped to different hospitals, and by the time he'd recovered enough to travel, the idea of facing that young officer's family with news of his death had seemed impossible. He'd told himself she was better off not knowing the details, better off mourning without having to picture her brother's final moments. But now she was here, 20 years later, and the weight of that broken promise settled on his shoulders like lead. "You knew him," Victoria said, reading the recognition in his face. "I can see it. He wrote about you in his letters. Jacob McKenna, the scout who pulled him out of enemy fire at Sharpsburg." "I should have come," Bear said quietly. "Should have found you after the war. Maybe, but you're here now." Victoria glanced toward the door again, then pressed something into his manacled hands. "This is real now, Jacob. The marriage certificate is forged, but everything else, the danger you're in, the corruption in this town, my need to help you, all of that is true." Bear looked down at the object she'd placed in his palm. It was a small gold locket, tarnished with age. Inside was a photograph of a young man in a cavalry uniform, his face serious but kind. Thomas Ashworth, exactly as Bear remembered him. "He gave me that locket the last time I saw him," Victoria said, "before he left for the war. He was so young, so certain he was going to change the world." "He was a good soldier," Bear said, his voice thick with emotion. "Brave. He died trying to save his men." Tears gathered in Victoria's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I know, I've always known. But I needed to hear it from someone who was there." The 15 minutes passed like heartbeats. They spoke in whispers about Thomas, about the war, about the 20 years that had passed between that battlefield promise and this moment. Bear learned that Victoria had never married, that she'd devoted herself to managing her family's business interests after her parents died, that she'd spent years wondering about the soldier her brother had written about. When Sheriff Bradley returned to escort them back to the courtroom, something had changed between them. The deception remained. Victoria was not really his wife. The marriage certificate was indeed forged. But the connection was real, forged in shared grief and the memory of a young man who died too far from home. As they walked back through the curious crowd, Bear found himself standing straighter despite the weight of his shackles. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't completely alone. Someone knew his story, understood his burden, and had chosen to stand with him despite the risk. The forged marriage certificate might be a lie, but the bond it represented was becoming something much more complicated than either of them had expected. That evening, Victoria sat in her room at the Cedar Ridge Hotel, a leather-bound journal open on the small writing desk before her. The accommodations were hardly what she was accustomed to. The mattress was lumpy, the walls thin enough to hear every conversation in neighboring rooms. and the single window looked out on the muddy main street rather than the manicured gardens of her Philadelphia estate. But she'd chosen to come here, to this rough frontier town where her brother's ghost had finally led her. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and began to write, as she had every evening for the past 15 years. October 15th, 1885. Dear Thomas, I found him today. The soldier you wrote about, the one who saved your life at Sharpsburg. His name is Jacob McKenna, though everyone here calls him Bear. He's exactly as you described, tall and strong, with eyes that have seen too much, but also kind. Despite what this place has done to him, he's in terrible trouble, Thomas. They want to hang him for doing the right thing, for saving innocent people just as he saved you. I couldn't let that happen. Not when I finally found him after all these years of searching. I did something today that would shock mother and father. I claimed to be his wife, forged documents to make it seem real. I know it's wrong, but sometimes wrong actions serve right purposes. You taught me that, didn't you? When you lied about your age to enlist, when you told me you were going off to glory instead of acknowledging you might die. Victoria paused, her pen hovering over the page as memories flooded back. She'd been 17 when Thomas left for the war, old enough to understand the danger, but too young to accept it. He'd been her protector since childhood, the one person who'd never treated her like a delicate flower, to be sheltered from the world's harsh realities. Their parents had been kind but distant, more concerned with their shipping business and social obligations than with their children's inner lives. Thomas had filled that void, teaching her to ride like a boy, to read beyond the approved books for young ladies, to think for herself, even when society discouraged such independence in women. When he died at Antietam, her world had crumbled. The official notification had been brief and impersonal. Lieutenant Thomas Ashworth killed in action while leading his men in a charge against Confederate positions. No details, no personal words, nothing to help her understand how someone so alive and vital could simply cease to exist. For years she'd wondered about his final moments. Had he been afraid? Had he thought of home? Had anyone been with him, or had he died alone among strangers? The letters he'd sent during his months of service had been her only clue. In them, he'd written about the other soldiers, farm boys from Ohio, shopkeepers from Pennsylvania, immigrants chasing the American dream with rifles in their hands. But one name had appeared repeatedly, Jacob McKenna, a scout and sharpshooter who seemed to have appointed himself Thomas's unofficial guardian. He's older than the rest of us, Thomas had written, maybe 30 or so, and he knows this country like he was born to it. The other boys call him Bear because he's built like one and just as dangerous when crossed. But he's got a gentle side too, spent half the night helping young Peters write a letter to his sweetheart. And yesterday I saw him carving a wooden horse for a child in one of the refugee camps. In another letter, dated just weeks before Antietam, Bear pulled me out of a tight spot today. Confederate sharpshooters had us pinned down, and I would have died if he hadn't come back for me. He says it's what soldiers do for each other, but I think it's more than that. There's something in his eyes, Vic, a sadness that goes deeper than this war. I think he's lost people too, maybe everyone who mattered to him. When this is over, I want to find a way to help him, to give him the family he seems to have lost. The final letter had come 2 days before the battle that killed him. If something happens to me, Vic, I want you to find Bear, Jacob McKenna from Colorado Territory. He needs to know he's not as alone in the world as he thinks. Promise me you'll find him, but the war had scattered men like leaves in a storm. By the time Victoria was old enough and independent enough to begin searching, Jacob McKenna had vanished into the vastness of the American frontier. She'd hired investigators, placed advertisements in territorial newspapers, even traveled west herself on several occasions. But the man had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him, until 3 days ago, when she'd overheard 2 travelers in a Denver hotel talking about a mountain man named Bear McKenna, who'd been arrested for killing a member of the notorious Dalton gang. Victoria had been in Denver on business, finalizing the sale of her family's shipping interests to a rival company. At 37, she'd never married despite numerous suitors, choosing instead to focus on preserving and growing the Ashworth fortune. She'd become one of the wealthiest unmarried women in Philadelphia, a status that gave her freedom, but also a kind of loneliness she rarely acknowledged. The decision to sell the business had been difficult but necessary. She'd grown tired of the endless social obligations, the careful maneuvering required to succeed in a man's world while maintaining proper feminine appearances. The frontier had always called to her, perhaps because Thomas had died fighting for it, or perhaps because it represented the kind of freedom women rarely found in civilized society. She'd bought a ticket to Cedar Ridge that very evening. Now, sitting in this shabby hotel room with her journal open before her, Victoria felt closer to her brother than she had in 20 years. Finding Jacob McKenna hadn't brought Thomas back, but it had given her a chance to honor his memory in a way that mattered. She returned to her writing. "The man they call Bear is nothing like I expected, Thomas. The years have marked him. He's grayer now, more weathered, with lines around his eyes that speak of long solitude. But there's still kindness in him, still that gentle strength you wrote about. When he looked at me today, really looked at me, I felt like he was seeing not just Victoria Ashworth, the Philadelphia heiress, but someone worth protecting. It's been so long since anyone looked at me that way. I know you'd approve of what I'm doing, even if the methods are questionable. That corrupt sheriff wants Jacob dead, and the Dalton gang won't rest until they've avenged their fallen brother. But I have resources they don't expect, connections they can't match. I've already wired my attorney in Philadelphia to send money for proper legal representation. And I've contacted a federal marshal I met at a charity function last year. The marriage deception troubles me, I'll admit. It goes against everything we were taught about honesty and propriety. But propriety never saved anyone's life, did it? Sometimes the right thing requires us to step outside society's neat little rules. Victoria set down her pen and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet main street. Most of the town was asleep now, though lamplight still glowed in the saloon windows, and she could hear the distant sound of a piano playing a melancholy tune. Somewhere in this town, Jacob McKenna was locked in a cell, probably wondering what kind of mad woman had claimed to be his wife. She'd seen the confusion in his eyes, the wariness of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected kindness. But she'd also seen recognition when she'd mentioned Thomas, and something that might have been gratitude when she'd pressed that locket into his hands. The locket had been her most precious possession for 20 years, the only tangible link to her brother's memory. Giving it to Jacob had felt right, like completing a circle that had been broken since Antietam. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Victoria tensed. It was nearly 10 o'clock, too late for any proper social call. In Philadelphia, such a visit would be scandalous. Here it might be dangerous. "Who is it?" she called softly. "Martha Morrison," came the reply. "The judge's wife, well, his late wife's sister." "Might I have a word?" Victoria opened the door to find a woman of perhaps 50, dressed in simple but clean clothing and carrying a small basket. Martha Morrison had kind eyes and greying hair arranged in a practical bun, the sort of woman who served as a community's unofficial mother figure. "I hope you'll forgive the late hour," Martha said, "but I wanted to speak with you privately." Away from prying eyes and wagging tongues, Victoria stepped aside to let her enter. "Of course. Please sit down." Martha settled into the room's single chair and fixed Victoria with a direct gaze. "I'll speak plainly, if you don't mind. Are you really married to Jacob McKenna?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a gunshot. Victoria considered lying, maintaining the deception she'd worked so hard to establish. But something in Martha's eyes suggested that dishonesty would be both useless and unwise. "No," Victoria said quietly. "I'm not." Martha nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "I thought not. Jacob's lived alone in those mountains for 20 years. A man doesn't keep a wife's secret that long, not in a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Are you going to expose me?" "That depends," Martha said, "on why you're really here. So Victoria told her about Thomas, about the letters, about 20 years of searching for the man who'd saved her brother's life. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing thoughtful. "Your brother sounds like he was a good man," Martha said finally. "And Jacob McKenna saved my nephew's life once, pulled him out of a river when the ice broke. He's a good man too, whatever that fool Bradley says. Then you'll help me?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering. "There's something you should know about this town. Mrs. Ashworth, about the Dalton gang and why Sheriff Bradley is so eager to see Jacob hang. I'm listening. The Daltons have been bleeding this territory dry for 2 years. They rob, they steal, they terrorize decent folks, and Bradley always manages to be somewhere else when they strike. Most of us suspect he's taking money from them, but we can't prove it. And now that Jacob killed one of them. Now Bradley needs a scapegoat, someone to blame for Samuel Dalton's death who can't implicate him in their crimes." Martha leaned forward. "But there's more. Eli Dalton, Samuel's older brother, he's not going to let this stand. Gang leader or not, he loved that boy. Word is he's riding toward Cedar Ridge with 12 men, planning to take Jacob from the jail and make an example of him." Victoria felt ice form in her stomach. "When?" "Soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. That's why Bradley's pushing for a quick trial. He wants Jacob dead before Eli gets here, so he can claim he was just following the law." The two women looked at each other in the lamplight, understanding passing between them like a shared burden. "What can we do?" Victoria asked. Martha smiled, and Victoria caught a glimpse of the steel that had helped this woman survive on the frontier. "Well, Mrs. McKenna," she said with deliberate emphasis, "I reckon we better make sure your husband gets a fair trial. And after that, we better help him stay alive long enough to appreciate it." The morning sun cast long shadows across Bear's cell when Victoria arrived with breakfast, and something that made his heart skip, Thomas Ashworth's military medal. The bronze cross lay heavy in her palm, its ribbon faded but the inscription still clear. "For valor, Lieutenant Thomas Ashworth, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. He earned this at Gettysburg," Victoria said quietly, passing the medal through the bars along with a plate of eggs and bacon from the hotel kitchen. 3 months before Antietam, before he met you." Bear took the medal with reverent hands, his calloused fingers tracing the raised lettering. The weight of it brought back memories he'd tried to bury, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the sounds of dying men calling for their mothers, the terrible responsibility of deciding who lived and who died in the chaos of battle. "I remember when they gave it to him," Bear said, his voice rough with emotion. "He was embarrassed by the attention. Said he was just doing his job." "That sounds like Thomas." Victoria settled onto a wooden crate that served as the only chair in the cramped jail. Sheriff Bradley had grudgingly allowed her daily visits, though he always positioned himself within earshot. He never could accept praise gracefully. Bear studied the medal, remembering the young officer who'd worn it with such reluctant pride. Thomas Ashworth had been everything Bear wasn't, educated, refined, from a good family with expectations and obligations. But war had a way of stripping away such distinctions, reducing men to their essential selves. "He talked about you constantly," Victoria continued, her voice low enough that Bradley couldn't hear from his desk. "About your sister, your plans after the war. He was going to help you rebuild, maybe find you work with his family's shipping business. He was a dreamer," Bear said, though not unkindly. "Thought the world was better than it is. Maybe, or maybe he saw what it could be." Victoria leaned closer to the bars. "Jacob, I need to tell you something about why Thomas's death changed me so much." Bear looked up from the medal, seeing pain in her dark eyes that went deeper than simple grief. "We weren't just brother and sister," Victoria said. "We were twins. Born minutes apart, Thomas first, then me. We shared everything growing up. Our parents were distant people, kind enough, but more interested in their business than their children. Thomas and I raised each other in many ways. The revelation hit Bear like a physical blow. Twins. That explained the intensity of her grief, the way she'd carried Thomas's memory for 20 years like a sacred trust. He'd known soldiers who'd lost brothers, but losing a twin must be like losing half of your soul. When he died, Victoria continued, I felt it. I was in Philadelphia attending a ladies' auxiliary meeting, and suddenly I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I knew something terrible had happened before we ever got the telegram. Bear nodded slowly. He'd heard similar stories from other soldiers, family members sensing death across impossible distances, connections that defied rational explanation. I've spent 20 years trying to fill the emptiness he left behind, Victoria said. Managing the family business, involving myself in charitable work, anything to keep busy. But nothing helped. Nothing made the loneliness go away until you found me, until I found you. She reached through the bars to touch his hand briefly. Finding you didn't bring Thomas back, but it gave me a purpose I'd forgotten I needed. A chance to honor his memory by helping someone he cared about. Bear felt something shift in his chest, a tightness that had been there so long he'd forgotten it was unusual. I should have come to you after the war. Should have kept my promise to him. You were wounded too, Jacob. I've done research over the years. I know about your injuries, about the months you spent in military hospitals. You had your own recovery to manage. Still should have come, Victoria smiled, and Bear saw echoes of her brother in the expression. Thomas wouldn't have blamed you. He understood that sometimes circumstances make it impossible to keep every promise. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared memory settling between them like an old friendship. Outside, Cedar Ridge was coming to life, the sounds of horses and wagons, voices calling out morning greetings, the steady rhythm of a frontier town beginning another day. There's something else, Victoria said, glancing toward Sheriff Bradley's desk. Martha Morrison told me last night that Eli Dalton is riding this way with a gang of men. They want revenge for Samuel's death. Bear nodded grimly. He'd been expecting something like this. Gang leaders didn't let the killing of family members go unanswered, especially not when it happened in front of witnesses. Eli Dalton had a reputation for creative cruelty. He wouldn't be satisfied with a simple lynching. When? Bear asked. Soon. Maybe today. Maybe tomorrow. Victoria's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide. Martha thinks Bradley wants this trial over quickly so he can claim he was just following the law when Eli arrives. Bear turned the medal over in his hands, feeling the weight of 20 years' worth of guilt and regret. Thomas Ashworth had died believing in justice, in the idea that good men could make a difference in an imperfect world. Now his sister was risking everything to save a man she barely knew, all because of promises made on a battlefield long ago. You should leave, Bear said quietly. Take the next stage back to Denver. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I walked into that courtroom. Victoria's voice carried steel beneath the silk. Besides, I have advantages that Bradley doesn't expect. Money, connections, resources he can't match. Money won't stop a bullet. No. But it can hire people who know how to deal with bullets. Victoria glanced around to make sure Bradley wasn't listening, then leaned closer. I've sent word to a federal marshal I know. He should arrive within the week. Bear felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. But experience had taught him to be wary of such feelings. A week might be too late. Then we'll have to make sure you survive until he gets here. Victoria stood, smoothing her dress. Judge Morrison is an honest man, Jacob. If we can get you a fair trial, present the real evidence, show what kind of man you really are. What kind of man am I? The question came out more bitter than Bear had intended. A killer who's been hiding in the mountains for 20 years. Victoria studied his face through the bars, her expression serious. You're the man who saved my brother's life. The man who risked everything to protect innocent people on that mountain road. The man who carved toys for refugee children in the middle of a war. She paused. You're the man Thomas saw when he looked at you, someone worth saving. Bear felt his throat tighten. He'd spent so many years thinking of himself as a man apart, someone whose capacity for violence made him unfit for civilized company. But Victoria saw something different, something her brother had apparently seen as well. Thomas believed in redemption. Victoria continued. He used to say that every man deserved a chance to be better than his worst moment, even if he never got the chance to help you himself. Maybe I can do it for him. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside drew their attention. Sheriff Bradley looked up from his desk as Deputy Collins entered, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. "Sheriff," Collins said, slightly out of breath. "Riders coming in from the north. Maybe 8 or 10 of them, moving fast." Bradley's face went pale. "Eli Dalton." "Can't tell yet, but—" Collins swallowed hard. "One of them's flying a black flag." Victoria felt ice form in her stomach. Even she knew what a black flag meant on the frontier. No quarter given, no mercy shown. Eli Dalton wasn't coming to negotiate or demand justice through legal channels. He was coming for blood. Bear stood up in his cell, every instinct honed by years of survival suddenly alert. "How long before they reach town?" "Maybe an hour," Collins replied. They stopped at Miller's ranch, probably to water their horses and ask questions. Bradley began pacing behind his desk, his usual bluster replaced by obvious fear. "This is bad. This is real bad. If Eli Dalton rides into Cedar Ridge looking for revenge, then give him what he wants," Bear said quietly. "Open the cell, let me walk out there and face him. No point in getting innocent people hurt. No." Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "Absolutely not. You're not sacrificing yourself to save a corrupt sheriff who helped create this mess." Bradley spun around, his face red with anger and fear. "Lady, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Eli Dalton don't care about your fancy clothes or your money. He'll burn this whole town down to get to McKenna. Then maybe it's time this town stood up to him," Victoria replied evenly. "How many years have you let the Daltons terrorize these people? How much blood is on your hands because you were too cowardly or too greedy to do your job?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Bradley's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he stopped when he saw Bear watching him through the bars. "Careful, Sheriff," Bear said softly. "Threatening a lady won't improve your situation." Deputy Collins looked back and forth between them, confusion clear on his young face. He was maybe 22, new to the job, and probably unaware of his boss's corruption. "Sheriff, what do we do? If Eli Dalton's coming here, we follow the law." Judge Morrison's voice came from the doorway. The small, neat man entered the jail office, his expression grim but determined. "Deputy Collins, I want every able-bodied man in town armed and ready. We're not handing anyone over to vigilantes." "Judge, you can't be serious," Bradley protested. "It's 8 or 10 armed men against a whole town," Morrison interrupted. "Cedar Ridge has maybe 40 men who can handle weapons. The Daltons have been terrorizing this territory for 2 years because people were too afraid or too isolated to fight back. Maybe it's time we showed them what organized resistance looks like." Bear felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the war. The sense of being part of something larger than himself, of fighting alongside men who shared common cause. "Judge, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but nothing, Mr. McKenna. You're in my custody, under the protection of this court. No gang of outlaws is going to change that." Morrison's eyes flashed behind his spectacles. "Besides, I've been reading the evidence in your case. The more I look at it, the more convinced I become that you acted in justified defense of innocent people." Victoria felt her heart skip. "Does that mean—" "It means we're going to have a proper trial with proper evidence and proper witnesses," Morrison replied. "Starting this afternoon, if Mr. McKenna is willing." Bear looked at the medal still clutched in his hands, thinking about the young officer who'd earned it with blood and courage. Thomas Ashworth had died fighting for what was right, never living to see whether his sacrifice made any difference. Maybe it was time to find out. "I'm willing," Bear said. The dusty floorboards of Bear's cell creaked as he paced the narrow space, his mind wrestling with memories and emotions he'd kept buried for 20 years. Victoria had left him with more than just Thomas's medal. She'd given him a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, correspondence between the Ashworth twins that somehow included references to him. Bear sat heavily on the cell's single cot and carefully unfolded the first letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but Thomas's neat handwriting was still legible. My dearest Victoria, the fighting has been terrible these past weeks, but I wanted you to know I'm safe, largely due to a remarkable man I've had the fortune to serve alongside. His name is Jacob McKenna, though the other soldiers call him Bear. He's perhaps the finest scout I've ever encountered. And more than that, he has a quality of character that seems rare in these dark times. Yesterday, he spent his entire evening helping young Murphy write a letter to his sweetheart back in Ohio. The boy can barely spell his own name, but Bear sat with him patiently, helping him find the words to express what was in his heart. Watching them together, I was reminded of the better angels of our nature that this war sometimes makes us forget. I've been thinking about what we'll do when this conflict ends. Father expects me to return to Philadelphia and take my place in the business, but I find myself wondering if there isn't some greater purpose I might serve. Bear speaks sometimes of the territories, of wide open spaces where a man might build something meaningful from nothing. Perhaps there's opportunity there for both of us. Bear's hands trembled slightly as he set the letter aside. To see himself through Thomas's eyes, not as a killer or a hermit, but as someone worth admiring, shook something loose in his chest that had been locked away since the war ended. The next letter was from Victoria to Thomas, her feminine script flowing across the page with obvious affection. Dearest brother, your letters about Mr. McKenna intrigue me greatly. He sounds like exactly the sort of man Father claims doesn't exist anymore. Honorable, without being sanctimonious, strong, without being cruel. I confess I find myself curious about this frontier scout who has so impressed my practical brother. If he truly means to seek his fortune in the territories after the war, perhaps you might convince him to visit Philadelphia first. I should very much like to meet the man who's been watching over you in my absence. Besides, someone with his evident skills might find opportunities with Father's shipping concerns. Bear felt a strange tightness in his throat. Victoria had been thinking about him even before they'd met, seeing possibilities he'd never imagined for himself. The woman who'd walked into that courtroom hadn't been a complete stranger after all. She'd been carrying an idea of him, formed through her brother's letters and her own generous imagination. The sound of raised voices from the street pulled his attention away from the letters. Through the small barred window, Bear could see townspeople gathering in agitated clusters, their faces tense with worry and determination. Word of Eli Dalton's approach had spread quickly, and Cedar Ridge was preparing for a fight. Deputy Collins appeared at the cell door, his young face serious. "Mr. McKenna, Judge Morrison wants to see you. Says it's time for that trial." Bear carefully folded the letters and placed them with Thomas's medal in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. As Collins unlocked the cell, Bear noticed the deputy's hands were steady despite the obvious stress of the situation. "You scared, son?" Bear asked, as they walked toward the makeshift courtroom. Collins considered the question seriously. "Yes, sir. But Judge Morrison says being scared don't matter as much as doing what's right when it counts." Bear nodded approvingly. "Your judge is a wise man." The saloon had been transformed once again into a courtroom, but the atmosphere was electric with tension. Every seat was filled, and men stood along the walls holding rifles and shotguns. Victoria sat in the front row, her elegant dress a stark contrast to the rough frontier clothing around her. But Bear noticed she'd adopted the same determined expression as the men preparing to defend their town. Judge Morrison called for order, his voice carrying surprising authority in the charged atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Jacob McKenna in the matter of Samuel Dalton's death. Regardless of external threats or pressures, this court will conduct itself according to law and evidence." Sheriff Bradley stood reluctantly to present the prosecution's case, but his usual bluster was notably absent. "The defendant killed Samuel Dalton on the mountain road 3 days ago. That's murder, plain and simple. Were there witnesses to this alleged murder?" Judge Morrison asked. "Well, yes, there were some travelers, but..." Then call them to testify. Bradley's face reddened. They've already left town, Judge. Went on to Denver. A murmur went through the crowd. Victoria rose smoothly from her seat. Your Honor, if I may, I believe I can locate these witnesses if given adequate time. The court appreciates your offer, Mrs. McKenna, but we have more pressing concerns at the moment. Morrison turned to Bear. Mr. McKenna, how do you plead to the charge of murder? Bear stood as straight as his shackles would allow. Not guilty, Your Honor. I was defending innocent people from armed robbery and assault. Can you tell the court exactly what happened on that mountain road? For the next 30 minutes, Bear recounted the events in careful detail. He described hearing the woman's scream, finding the Dalton gang terrorizing the family, his decision to intervene despite the risk to himself. The courtroom listened in complete silence, hanging on every word. When he finished, Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. McKenna, in your military service, did you ever receive training in the rules of engagement regarding civilian protection? Yes, sir. We were taught that soldiers have a duty to protect innocent civilians when possible, even at personal risk. And you considered this situation to fall under those guidelines? I did, Your Honor. Those people were going to be robbed and likely killed. The young woman was in immediate danger of assault or worse. Martha Morrison rose from her seat near the back of the room. Your Honor, might I say something? Mrs. Morrison? Jacob McKenna saved my nephew's life 4 years ago. Billy fell through ice on Miller Creek in the middle of winter. Jacob pulled him out and carried him 2 miles through a blizzard to get him medical attention. He never asked for thanks or payment, just made sure Billy was safe and went on his way. Other voices joined in from around the room. He helped me track down rustlers that stole my cattle, called out a rancher named Peterson. It wouldn't take a penny for his trouble. Guided my boy home when he got lost hunting, added another man. He could have charged me plenty for that, but said it was just the neighborly thing to do. Judge Morrison listened to testimony after testimony, his expression growing more thoughtful with each account. Finally, he raised his hand for silence. Based on the evidence presented, and in the absence of prosecution witnesses to contradict the defendant's account, I find the charge of murder to be without sufficient foundation. However, given the approaching threat to this community, I'm postponing final judgment until the courtroom doors burst open with a crash that made everyone reach for their weapons. But instead of Eli Dalton and his gang, a man in a federal marshal's badge strode in, his long coat dusty from hard riding. Marshal Andrew Fletcher, representing the territorial government, he announced in a voice that carried clear authority. I have warrants for the arrest of Eli Dalton and his associates on charges of robbery, murder, and terrorizing territorial citizens. Victoria felt her heart leap. The marshal she'd contacted had arrived sooner than expected, bringing the weight of federal law to bear on the situation. Marshal Fletcher, Judge Morrison said, relief evident in his voice. Your timing is impeccable. We were just concluding a trial related to the Dalton gang's activities. Fletcher's experienced eyes swept the room, taking in the armed townspeople and the obvious tension. I understand there may be a confrontation coming. How many men is Dalton bringing? Maybe 10, Deputy Collins replied. They're flying a black flag. The marshal nodded grimly. Then they're not planning to take prisoners. But they're also not expecting to face federal authority backed by an organized defense. He looked at Bear, still in shackles at the defendant's table. You must be Jacob McKenna. Mrs. Ashworth's telegram described your situation. Marshal, Bear said respectfully, from what I've heard, you did the territory a service by killing Samuel Dalton. The man was wanted for at least 3 murders that I know of. Fletcher turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to request that Mr. McKenna be released into my custody. A man of his experience might be useful in the upcoming confrontation. Judge Morrison didn't hesitate. Deputy Collins, remove Mr. McKenna's shackles. Mr. McKenna, you're free pending final resolution of the charges against you. As the iron shackles fell away from his wrists and ankles, Bear felt 20 years of spiritual weightlifting as well. He flexed his hands, feeling strength return to his limbs, but more than that, feeling purpose return to his life. Victoria approached as the courtroom began to empty, people preparing for the coming fight. "Jacob, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Bear said quietly, looking out the window toward the approaching dust cloud on the horizon. "These people stood up for me when they had every reason not to. It's time I returned the favor." He looked down at Thomas's medal, still pressed against his chest in his shirt pocket. Perhaps this was the purpose Thomas had seen in him all those years ago, not just the ability to survive alone, but the strength to stand with others when it mattered most. The Dalton gang was coming to Cedar Ridge expecting to find a frightened town ready to hand over their prisoner. Instead, they were about to discover what happened when good people decided they'd had enough of being afraid. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street when Victoria made a discovery that changed everything. She'd returned to her hotel room to retrieve additional ammunition for the town's defenders when she noticed something odd about Thomas's final letter, the one she'd carried for 20 years without truly examining closely. The envelope bore 2 postmarks. Victoria had always assumed Thomas's last letter had been mailed directly from his unit, but now she could see there were actually 2 stamps, 2 different dates. The first was from Antietam, Maryland, dated September 15, 1862, 2 days before the battle. But there was another postmark underneath, from Washington, D.C., dated October 3rd, nearly 3 weeks later. With trembling fingers, Victoria carefully opened the envelope and removed not 1 letter but 2. The first was the farewell letter she'd read countless times, Thomas's final words to his beloved sister. But folded behind it was another sheet of paper she'd never seen before, in handwriting she didn't recognize. "Miss Ashworth, my name is Jacob McKenna. I was with your brother when he died at Antietam. He asked me to write to you, to tell you how he passed, and to deliver his personal effects. This is the hardest letter I've ever had to write. Thomas spoke of you constantly in his final hours. He was proud of your strength, your independence, your refusal to be bound by society's expectations of what a woman should be. He said you had the courage of 10 men and the heart of an angel. He died saving his men, Miss Ashworth. Confederate sharpshooters had pinned down his unit, and Thomas led a charge to break their position. He took a bullet meant for a young private named Davies, pushed the boy to safety even as he was falling. He lived long enough to know his men were safe. Before he died, he made me promise 2 things. First, that I would find you and make sure you knew he died thinking of you. Second, that I would ask if you might consider marriage to a man who loved your brother like family and would spend his life trying to be worthy of Thomas's memory. I know this is presumptuous of me, Miss Ashworth. I'm a common soldier with no prospects, no education, nothing to offer a lady of your station. But Thomas believed we would suit each other, said we shared the same quiet strength, the same determination to do right even when it cost us dearly. If you're willing to consider his proposal, I'll be in Philadelphia after my discharge from the hospital. If not, please know that carrying Thomas's memory will be honor enough for the rest of my days. Your servant Jacob McKenna. Victoria sank onto the bed, the letter trembling in her hands. Thomas hadn't just written about Jacob McKenna. He'd tried to arrange a marriage between them from his deathbed. And Jacob had agreed, had been willing to travel to Philadelphia to court a woman he'd never met purely out of love for his fallen friend. But the letter had never been delivered. A third piece of paper fell from the envelope, an official military document dated October 15th, 1862, Victoria. Recognized the format from her family's business. Dealings with government contracts. It was a casualty report, listing Jacob McKenna as missing in action, presumed dead. The pieces of a 20-year-old tragedy fell into place. Jacob had written the letter, but had been wounded again before he could send it. Some well-meaning clerk at the military hospital had mailed Thomas's final letter along with Jacob's, not realizing they were separate correspondence. By the time Jacob recovered, he'd probably been told that his letter to Victoria Ashworth had been delivered with news of her brother's death. He'd assumed she'd received his proposal and chosen not to respond. She'd assumed he'd simply disappeared. abandoning his promise to Thomas without explanation, 20 years of separation, of wondering what might have been, all because of a filing mistake in a military hospital. Victoria pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of lost possibilities. If Jacob's letter had reached her in 1862, would she have accepted? She'd been 19, heartbroken by Thomas's death, desperately lonely in a world that suddenly felt empty and meaningless. The prospect of marrying a man her beloved brother had chosen for her, someone who understood the depth of her loss, she probably would have said yes. The sound of gunshots from the street below shattered her reverie. Victoria rushed to the window and saw riders pouring into town from the north end of Main Street. Eli Dalton had arrived, and the battle for Cedar Ridge was about to begin. But first, she had to find Jacob. Victoria grabbed her small, pearl-handled derringer from her traveling case, a gift from her father years ago when she'd started traveling for business, and ran for the stairs. The hotel lobby was chaos, with guests and staff barricading windows and extinguishing lamps to avoid drawing gunfire. "Mrs. McKenna," Martha Morrison called out from behind the front desk. "Get away from those windows." Victoria ignored the warning and pushed through the hotel's front doors onto the wooden sidewalk. The street was a war zone, townspeople firing from doorways and second-story windows, outlaws on horseback returning fire as they tried to control the main thoroughfare. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with dust and the screams of wounded horses. She spotted Jacob immediately. He was positioned behind a water trough near the jail, methodically firing at the attacking riders with the rifle someone had given him. Even at this distance, Victoria could see the difference in his movements, the careful precision of an experienced soldier. Each shot deliberate and effective. Marshal Fletcher was 20 yards to Jacob's left, using the corner of the general store for cover as he tried to coordinate the town's defense. Deputy Collins was with him, the young man's face pale but determined as he reloaded his shotgun. "Jacob," Victoria called out, but her voice was lost in the din of battle. One of Dalton's men wheeled his horse toward the hotel, apparently deciding to eliminate potential threats from that direction. Victoria saw the outlaw raising his rifle toward her and acted on pure instinct, raising her derringer and pulling the trigger. The small gun bucked in her hand, and the outlaw spun from his saddle with a cry of surprise and pain. The brief distraction was enough for Jacob to put a bullet through the man's chest, ending the threat permanently. Their eyes met across the chaos of the street, and Victoria saw something change in Jacob's expression. He'd seen her defend herself, seen her stand and fight instead of cowering in safety. The recognition in his gaze told her he was remembering a different woman, one who'd been brave enough to consider marrying a stranger based solely on her brother's recommendation. "Get to cover!" Jacob shouted across the street, gesturing toward the stable at the far end of town. "This isn't over yet!" But Victoria was already moving, not toward safety, but toward the jail where Jacob was fighting. She had 20 years of words to say to him, 20 years of misunderstandings to clear up, and she wasn't going to let Eli Dalton's gang prevent that conversation. As she ran across the street, dodging bullets and leaping over debris, Victoria clutched Jacob's long-lost letter in her free hand. The marriage certificate she'd forged might have been a lie when she'd created it, but the feelings it represented, the connection she'd felt to this man she'd never met, had been real from the very beginning. Thomas had seen what they could be together, even across the impossible gulf of war and circumstance. Now it was up to Victoria and Jacob to decide whether his vision had been worth 20 years of waiting. A bullet whined past her ear as she dove behind the water trough next to Jacob, landing hard on the dusty ground. He reached out to steady her, his strong hand warm against her arm. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice rough with concern and something else, something that might have been recognition of possibilities neither of them had dared to name. "No," Victoria gasped, pressing the letter into his hand. "But I need you to read this. I need you to understand why I really came here." Jacob looked down at the yellowed paper, his eyes widening as he recognized his own handwriting from 2 decades ago. For a moment, The battle around them seemed to fade as the weight of missed chances and lost opportunities settled between them like a bridge finally being built across a 20-year chasm. "You never got it," he said, understanding flooding his voice. "And you never got my answer," Victoria replied, looking into his eyes with an intensity that had nothing to do with the gunfight raging around them. Above the sound of gunshots and shouting men, Jacob McKenna heard something he'd thought was lost forever. The sound of his own heart learning to hope again. The battle for Cedar Ridge had been raging for 30 minutes when Eli Dalton called for a temporary ceasefire. His voice carried across the bullet-scarred main street with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, even by his enemies. "McKenna!" Dalton shouted from his position behind the overturned stagecoach at the north end of town. "I know you can hear me, Mountain Man." Bear looked up from reloading his rifle, sweat and gunpowder residue streaking his face. Beside him, Victoria was methodically checking the loads in the spare revolvers they'd gathered from the jail's weapons rack. Her elegant dress was torn and dusty, but her hands were steady and her eyes clear. "What do you want, Dalton?" Bear called back. "I want the man who killed my brother." Eli's voice cracked with grief and rage. "Send him out, and the rest of this town can live." Marshal Fletcher, crouched behind the general store's loading dock, shook his head grimly. "Don't believe him, McKenna. Dalton's got federal warrants on his head. He can't afford to leave witnesses." Bear knew the marshal was right. Eli Dalton was trapped now, facing federal law and an organized defense, instead of the scattered, frightened communities he usually preyed upon. A man in that position became desperate, and desperate men made the worst kind of enemy. "I got a counter-proposal," Bear shouted. "You and your boys ride out now, and maybe some of you live to see tomorrow." Dalton's laugh carried no humor. "You killed Samuel, you son of a bitch. My baby brother. He was just 19 years old." Victoria felt a pang of unexpected sympathy. She understood the grief of losing a sibling, the way it could consume everything else in your life. But Samuel Dalton had been terrorizing innocent people, threatening that young girl on the mountain road. Sometimes good people died young, and sometimes bad people did too. "Your brother was about to assault an innocent girl," Bear replied, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I gave him a chance to walk away. He chose to fight. He chose to die," Eli screamed back. "And now you're going to join him." The sound of breaking glass from the hotel made everyone turn. Two of Dalton's men were climbing through a second-story window, trying to get behind the town's defensive line. Deputy Collins spotted them first and put a shotgun blast through the window, sending both outlaws tumbling back into the street. "They're trying to flank us," Marshal Fletcher observed grimly. "Won't be long before they figure out they can use the alleys to get around behind us." Bear studied the tactical situation with the eye of a veteran soldier. Cedar Ridge's main street was maybe 300 yards long, lined with wooden buildings that provided decent cover but could also burn if someone got creative with oil and matches. The townspeople were fighting bravely, but they were shopkeepers and farmers, not soldiers. Against experienced outlaws, courage alone wouldn't be enough. "We need to end this quickly," Bear said, checking his ammunition. "Before they realize they can burn us out." Victoria looked at him sharply. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about something your brother taught me during the war." Bear pulled Thomas's medal from his shirt pocket, the bronze catching the afternoon sunlight. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense." Judge Morrison, who'd been coordinating ammunition supplies from the relative safety of the jail, overheard the conversation. "Mr. McKenna, you're not seriously considering going out there alone?" "No." Bear looked around at the faces watching him, townspeople who'd stood up for him when they had every reason not to, a federal marshal who'd ridden hard to bring justice to their community, a woman who'd risked everything to save a man she barely knew. "I'm considering going out there with friends." Martha Morrison appeared at the judge's elbow, her graying hair escaping from its practical bun, but her eyes sharp with determination. "What do you need?" "Diversions. Something to split their attention while a small group gets close enough to end this." Bear turned to Marshal Fletcher. "How many men can you spare for a flanking movement?" 3, maybe 4, Fletcher replied after a moment's consideration. But that leaves the main line pretty thin. Won't matter if we can take out Eli Dalton and break their leadership, Bear said. These aren't soldiers. They're following one man out of greed and fear. Remove him and they'll scatter. Victoria studied the layout of the buildings, her mind working through possibilities with the same strategic thinking that had made her successful in business. The stable behind Murphy's saloon. If you could get there without being seen, you'd have a clear shot at their position. Getting there's the problem, Deputy Collins pointed out. It's 200 yards of open ground. Not if we create enough noise and confusion from this end, Victoria said thoughtfully. Draw their attention while you move. Bear looked at her with growing admiration. The elegant lady from Philadelphia was thinking like a combat veteran, seeing angles and possibilities that even some of the men had missed. It could work, Marshal Fletcher agreed reluctantly. But it's dangerous as hell. One mistake, and you're caught in the open with nowhere to run. Then we better not make any mistakes. Bear checked his weapons one final time, the rifle someone had given him. A pair of revolvers taken from the jail's gun rack, and a knife borrowed from the hotel kitchen. It wasn't his familiar hunting blade, but it would serve if things came to close quarters. Victoria caught his arm as he prepared to move. Jacob, wait! She pulled something from her dress pocket, a small gold wedding band, simple and unadorned. This was my mother's. I've carried it for 20 years, never knowing why. Bear stared at the ring, understanding the gesture but not quite believing it. Victoria, I know this isn't the time or place, she said quickly, but I need you to know. That letter you wrote, the proposal Thomas asked you to make, my answer would have been yes. It would have been yes then, and it's yes now. The world seemed to stop around them, despite the chaos of the gunfight. Bear took the ring with hands that weren't quite steady, feeling the weight of 20 years' worth of what-ifs and might-have-beens. When this is over, he said quietly, we'll talk about what that means. Really talk, not just the desperate words of people facing death. When this is over, Victoria agreed. We'll have all the time in the world. Bear slipped the ring onto his little finger, the only one small enough to hold it securely. Then he kissed Victoria's forehead, a gentle gesture that somehow carried more weight than passionate embraces. Marshal, Bear said, turning back to business. Give me 10 minutes to get in position. Then make as much noise as you can from this end. Fletcher nodded grimly. 10 minutes. After that, all hell breaks loose. Bear made his way through the back doors and alleys of Cedar Ridge, moving with the silent precision of a man who'd spent decades hunting in mountain forests. Behind him, he could hear the townspeople preparing for their part in the plan, checking weapons, distributing ammunition, whispering final instructions to each other. The stable was an old building that smelled of hay and horse sweat, but it offered perfect concealment and a clear view of the outlaw's position. Bear settled into the shadows near a broken window, his rifle trained on the overturned stagecoach where Eli Dalton was directing his men. Through his sights, Bear could see Dalton clearly for the first time. The man was maybe 40, with the lean, hard look of someone who'd lived by violence for most of his adult life. But there was genuine grief in his face too, the kind of pain that came from losing someone you loved. Bear understood that grief had carried it himself for 20 years. The difference was that Eli Dalton was letting his grief turn him into something monstrous, while Bear had learned to carry his quietly, using it to make himself stronger rather than more destructive. The sound of sustained gunfire from the main street told Bear that Marshal Fletcher had begun the diversion. Dalton's men turned their attention eastward, toward the obvious threat, exactly as planned. Bear settled his rifle against his shoulder and drew a bead on Eli Dalton's chest. One shot would end this, eliminate the gang's leader, and probably scatter the rest of his men. It was the smart tactical choice, the safe choice, the choice that would save the most lives, but something held him back. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas Ashworth, who'd always believed in giving men a chance to choose a better path. Maybe it was Victoria's presence in his life, reminding him that there were alternatives to violence even in desperate situations. Or maybe it was just 20 years of solitude teaching him that killing, even justified killing, always left scars on the soul. "Dalton," Bear called out from the stable. "This is Jacob McKenna." The outlaw leader spun around, his rifle swinging toward Bear's position. But Bear had deliberately positioned himself in deep shadow, visible enough to be heard, but not enough to present a clear target. "I'm the man who killed your brother," Bear continued, "and I'm giving you one chance to end this without more bloodshed. You bastard." Dalton screamed, firing wildly at the stable. His bullets splintered wood but found no flesh. "Come out and face me like a man." "I'll come out," Bear replied steadily. "But first you need to understand something about Samuel's death. He wasn't just robbing those people. He was about to assault a 16-year-old girl. I gave him every opportunity to walk away. The gunfire from both positions had died down as everyone strained to hear the conversation between the two men who'd brought this violence to Cedar Ridge. He was my little brother." Eli's voice broke with anguish. "I raised him after our parents died. He was all the family I had left." "I know what it's like to lose family," Bear said quietly. "I know the kind of hole it tears in your soul. But your brother made his choices, and they led him down a dark path. Don't let grief make you follow him there." For a moment, Bear thought he might have gotten through to the man. Eli Dalton lowered his rifle slightly, his face twisted with internal conflict. Then one of his men, a scarred gunfighter Bear didn't recognize, whispered something in Dalton's ear. The outlaw leader's expression hardened again, and Bear knew the moment for words had passed. "You killed him," Dalton said, his voice cold as winter wind. "And now you're gonna pay." Bear sighed and settled his rifle more firmly against his shoulder. He'd tried to give the man a choice, just as he'd given Samuel Dalton a choice on that mountain road. Some people just couldn't accept alternatives to violence. The brass cabin deed in his shirt pocket, the legal proof of his mountain homestead that Judge Morrison had entered as evidence of his good character, crinkled as he adjusted his position. That piece of paper represented 20 years of honest work, of building something meaningful from nothing. It was proof that Jacob McKenna was more than just a killer, more than just a man running from his past, but sometimes even honest men had to fight. "Marshal Fletcher," Bear called out. "On my signal, give me covering fire toward the stagecoach." "Ready when you are," came the reply. Bear took a deep breath and felt the familiar calm that had carried him through countless battles. Thomas's medal pressed against his chest, Victoria's ring circled his finger, and the weight of 20 years' worth of choices, good and bad, settled on his shoulders. He'd spent 2 decades hiding from the world, convinced that his capacity for violence made him unfit for civilized society. But Victoria had shown him something different. She'd seen past the mountain hermit to the man Thomas Ashworth had believed in. The soldier who'd risked his life to protect the innocent. Maybe it was time to stop running from what he was and start embracing what he could become. "Now!" Bear shouted, and stepped out of the shadows into the afternoon sunlight. The final confrontation had begun. Bear stepped into the dusty street with the sun at his back, casting his shadow long across the blood-stained ground. The badge Marshal Fletcher had given him caught the light, a temporary deputy's star that carried the full weight of federal law. For the first time in 20 years, Jacob McKenna was wearing a symbol of justice rather than running from it. Eli Dalton and his remaining men, maybe 6 of them now, the others having fled or fallen, turned their weapons toward this lone figure walking steadily down the center of Main Street. The outlaw leader's face was twisted with grief and rage, his rifle trained on Bear's chest. "You think that tin star makes you bulletproof?" Dalton snarled. "I think it makes me responsible," Bear replied, never breaking stride. "Responsible for ending this before any more innocent people get hurt." Behind him, Bear could hear the townspeople emerging from their defensive positions, following his lead despite the obvious danger. Judge Morrison was there, clutching a shotgun with determined hands. Deputy Collins flanked him, young and scared, but unwilling to let Bear face this alone. Martha Morrison had armed herself with her late husband's hunting rifle. her face set with frontier steel, but it was Victoria who caught Bear's attention as she stepped up beside him, her small derringer steady in her grip. The elegant Philadelphia heiress had transformed into something he'd never expected, a true partner, someone willing to face danger at his side, rather than waiting safely in the background. "This is between me and McKenna," Dalton shouted, gesturing wildly with his rifle. "The rest of you back off. It stopped being between just you and me when you brought a gang to terrorize this town," Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet street. "Now it's between you and everyone who's tired of living in fear." Marshal Fletcher appeared from behind the general store, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Eli Dalton, by the authority of the territorial government, I'm placing you and your men under arrest for robbery, murder, and conspiracy to commit violence against federal officers." Dalton laughed bitterly. "Arrest? You think I'm going to let you put me in a cage after what this bastard did to Samuel?" "Your brother was a killer and a rapist," Victoria said coldly, her cultured voice cutting through Dalton's bluster. "Jacob saved innocent lives by stopping him. If you can't see the difference between justice and murder, then you're no better than Samuel was." The words hit Dalton like a physical blow. His face went white with rage, and Bear saw the moment when grief finally pushed the man past any hope of reason. "Kill them!" Dalton screamed to his men.
"Kill them all!"
The street exploded into violence. Bear dove to his right as Dalton's rifle barked, the bullet passing close enough to his ear that he felt the heat of its passage. He rolled behind a horse trough and came up firing, his first shot taking down the scarred gunfighter who'd whispered poison in Dalton's ear. Victoria had dropped to one knee beside a wooden crate, her derringer speaking twice in quick succession. One of Dalton's men spun away with a cry of pain, clutching a shattered shoulder. The woman, who'd never fired a gun in anger before today, was proving to be a surprisingly effective combatant. Marshal Fletcher and Deputy Collins were working as a team, their rifles providing steady, disciplined fire that kept the outlaws pinned behind their makeshift barricade. Judge Morrison had positioned himself to cover the alley between buildings, preventing any flanking attempts. But it was Martha Morrison who surprised everyone. The middle-aged woman had worked her way around to the north end of the street, using her knowledge of the town's backways to get behind the outlaw's position. Her hunting rifle cracked once, and another of Dalton's men dropped his weapon and stumbled into the open, hands raised in surrender. "Enough!" Eli Dalton roared, emerging from behind the overturned stagecoach with wild eyes and smoking guns. "McKenna! Face me, you coward!" Bear looked at the man across 30 yards of dusty ground and saw something that made his heart heavy. Eli Dalton was beyond reason now, consumed by grief and rage and the terrible certainty that dying violently was better than living with his pain. Bear had been there himself. In the dark, months after the war, when survivor's guilt had nearly driven him to eat his own gun. The only thing that had saved him was the vast silence of the mountains, where a man could find peace if he looked hard enough for it. Eli Dalton had never found that peace. "I'm right here," Bear said, stepping into the open with his rifle lowered. "But this doesn't have to end with more death." "Yes, it does," Dalton replied, raising both his revolvers. "It ends with you joining my brother in hell." The two men faced each other in the classic pose of the frontier, 40 yards apart, weapons ready, surrounded by the detritus of violence and the watching eyes of an entire community. But this wasn't a dime novel showdown between heroes and villains. This was the collision of two men, shaped by loss, by violence, by the harsh realities of a world that offered few second chances. One had found a way to carry his pain without letting it poison everything around him. The other had not. "I'm sorry about your brother," Bear said quietly. "I'm sorry about all of it." "Sorry don't bring back the dead," Dalton replied, and drew his guns. Bear was faster. He'd always been faster. The thunder of gunshots echoed off the buildings lining Cedar Ridge's main street, followed by a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eli Dalton lay motionless in the dust, his unfired revolvers scattered beside him, while Bear stood with smoking rifle in hand. his face grave with the weight of what he'd been forced to do. Victoria felt her heart stop as she watched Bear stagger slightly, one hand pressed to his left shoulder where dark blood was seeping through his shirt. Dalton had gotten off one shot before Bear's bullet found its mark. Not enough to kill, but enough to remind everyone that violence always extracted its price from both sides. Jacob. Victoria was at his side in an instant, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. The small wedding ring he wore, her mother's ring, caught the light as he lowered his rifle. "I'm all right," Bear said quietly, though his face was pale with pain and exhaustion. "Just a graze." Martha Morrison appeared with her medical kit, the same one she'd used to treat injuries throughout Cedar Ridge for the past decade. "Let me have a look at that shoulder," she said with professional calm. The remaining members of Dalton's gang, those who hadn't fled or surrendered, were being rounded up by Marshal Fletcher and Deputy Collins. The fight was over, but the cost was written across every face in the street. Good men had been wounded, property destroyed, and the peace of a community shattered by the consequences of old violence. Judge Morrison approached slowly, his shotgun still in his hands, but pointed at the ground. "Mr. McKenna, in light of today's events and the testimony provided during your trial, I'm officially dismissing all charges against you. You acted in defense of innocent life, both on the mountain road and here in Cedar Ridge." Bear nodded his thanks, but his attention was focused on Victoria as she helped Martha clean and bandage his shoulder wound. The woman who'd walked into that courtroom 3 days ago claiming to be his wife was now tending his injuries with the gentle competence of someone who'd made herself indispensable to his life. "The ring," Victoria said softly as Martha finished her work. "It's yours now, if you want it." Bear looked down at the simple gold band on his finger, remembering the moment she'd given it to him with words that had changed everything between them. "Are you sure? This isn't just battle fever or the fear of dying." Victoria's dark eyes met his with the same direct honesty that had first caught his attention in that makeshift courtroom. "I've had 20 years to think about this, Jacob. 20 years to wonder what my life would have been like if that letter had reached me. Now I know, and what do you know? That Thomas was right about us, that we do suit each other." She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the lines carved by years of solitude and hardship. "That I don't want to spend another 20 years wondering what might have been." Marshal Fletcher interrupted before Bear could respond, his expressions serious despite their victory. "McKenna, I've got a proposition for you. The territorial government needs men like you, experienced, reliable, willing to stand up to the kind of scum that's been plaguing these settlements. You offering me a job, Marshal? I'm offering you a chance to make a real difference. Federal Deputy Marshal, based here in Cedar Ridge if you want. Good pay, federal authority, and the backing of Washington when you go up against organized crime." Bear considered the offer carefully. 3 days ago, he'd been a hermit facing a hangman's noose, convinced that his capacity for violence made him unfit for civilized society. Now he was being offered a chance to use that same capacity in service of justice and protection. "What about my mountain cabin?" he asked. "Keep it," Fletcher replied. "Use it as a retreat when you need solitude. But this territory needs men who understand both worlds, the wilderness and civilization." "You've proven you can bridge that gap." Victoria squeezed Bear's uninjured hand. "It's your choice, Jacob, but you should know that I've made mine, which is, I'm staying in Cedar Ridge. I've already spoken with Judge Morrison about purchasing property here, maybe starting a business that could help this community grow. The frontier needs people willing to build something lasting, not just extract wealth and leave." Bear stared at her in amazement. "You'd give up Philadelphia? Your family's business, your social position, everything you've built there?" "I've already given it up," Victoria replied simply. "Sold the business, settled my affairs, said my goodbyes. I came west looking for you, but I found something more, a place where I can be useful, where I can make choices based on what I believe rather than what society expects." The implications of her words settled over Bear like sunrise over mountain peaks. She wasn't just offering to marry him. She was offering to build a life together, to create something neither of them could accomplish alone. "The badge," Bear said to Marshal Fletcher. "Does it come with the authority to perform marriages?" Fletcher grinned. "As a matter of fact, it does. Federal marshals can officiate at weddings when no other qualified officials are available." Judge Morrison stepped forward with a smile. "Though if you'd prefer a civilian ceremony, I'd be honored to perform the service." Bear looked around at the faces surrounding them, Martha Morrison beaming with maternal pride, Deputy Collins grinning despite his exhaustion, townspeople who'd risked their lives to defend a man they barely knew. These weren't just witnesses to a wedding proposal. They were the foundation of a community he was being invited to join. "Victoria Ashworth," Bear said formally, removing her mother's ring from his little finger and holding it out to her. "Will you marry me? Not because your brother asked me to, not because we've been through danger together, but because I love you and want to spend whatever years I have left making you happy." Victoria's smile was radiant as she extended her left hand. "Jacob McKenna, I thought you'd never ask properly." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, catching the afternoon light with the same brilliance as the tears of joy on her cheeks. Around them, the people of Cedar Ridge began to cheer, their voices rising above the dusty street where violence had so recently held sway. "When?" Victoria asked. "Right now," Bear replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We've waited 20 years already. I don't want to wait another day." Judge Morrison cleared his throat. "Well then, if Marshal Fletcher will serve as witness and Martha Morrison will stand for the bride, I suppose we can have ourselves a wedding right here in the street." As the impromptu ceremony began, Bear felt something he'd thought was lost forever, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. The badge on his chest represented not just authority, but responsibility. The ring on Victoria's finger symbolized not just love, but partnership. And the faces surrounding them promised not just acceptance, but genuine community. Thomas Ashworth's vision, formed in the desperate clarity of a battlefield 20 years ago, was finally coming to pass. Two lonely people had found each other at last, and in doing so, had discovered they were no longer alone in the world. 6 months later, the morning sun painted Cedar Ridge's Main Street gold as Victoria McKenna stepped onto the porch of the town's newest business, Ashworth and McKenna General Merchandise and Shipping. The bullet holes from that violent October day had been repaired, and the fresh paint on the storefront spoke of a community committed to growth rather than merely surviving. The new marriage certificate, genuine this time, hung framed on the wall inside, next to Thomas Ashworth's military medal and a photograph of the couple taken on their wedding day. But the most precious document was one that few people ever saw, Jacob's original proposal letter from 1862, carefully preserved between glass panes and kept in their private office as a reminder of how patient love could overcome even the longest separations. Victoria smoothed her practical cotton dress, a far cry from the silk gown she'd once favored, and walked across the street to the marshal's office where her husband was preparing for his morning rounds. Federal Deputy Marshal Jacob McKenna had proven surprisingly effective at bringing law and order to the territory, his reputation for fairness matched only by his unwillingness to tolerate those who preyed upon the innocent. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," Deputy Collins called out from his desk. The young man had grown into his responsibilities over the past months, his initial nervousness replaced by quiet competence. Marshals checking the overnight reports from Silverton. Victoria found Bear. She still thought of him by that name, though the territory knew him as Marshal McKenna, poring over telegrams and written reports from other settlements. The badge sat easily on his chest now, no longer the foreign symbol it had seemed that first day. "Anything serious?" Victoria asked, settling into the chair beside his desk that everyone in town had learned to think of as hers. "The Carmichael gang hit another supply wagon near Durango," Bear replied, his expression troubled. "Third one this month. They're getting bolder." Victoria studied the map on the wall, where colored pins marked recent criminal activity. Her head for business had proven invaluable in tracking patterns and predicting where trouble might strike next. They're moving north, following the mining routes. At this rate, they'll reach Cedar Ridge within the month. That's what I'm thinking too. Bear leaned back in his chair, absently touching the scar on his left shoulder, a permanent reminder of the day their life together had truly begun. Might need to take a posse out there, see if we can cut them off before they get this far. How long would you be gone? Week, maybe 2. Depends on how well they cover their tracks. Bear reached over to take her hand, their wedding rings catching the morning light, streaming through the office window. I know it's not easy, me being away so much. Victoria squeezed his hand gently. Jacob, I married a man who'd spent 20 years alone in the mountains. Did you think I'd expect you to become a shopkeeper overnight? Some women might. Some women didn't wait 20 years to find the right man. Victoria stood and moved to the window, looking out at the bustling street. Besides, someone needs to keep the peace out there. Better it should be someone who understands the difference between justice and revenge. That afternoon, they rode out to their mountain cabin together, a journey they made whenever Bear's duties allowed. The little homestead had become their sanctuary, a place where the federal marshal could set aside his badge and become simply a man who loved his wife and the wilderness that had shaped him. The cabin itself was much as Bear had left it 6 months ago, though Victoria's touches were evident everywhere. Curtains in the windows, books on the shelves, a garden plot where she'd planted vegetables and flowers. She'd taken to mountain life with surprising enthusiasm, learning to hunt and fish and read weather signs with the same determination she'd once applied to business ledgers. I've been thinking, Victoria said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks purple and gold, about what we want our legacy to be. Bear looked at her curiously. Legacy? Thomas and I used to talk about it when we were children. What mark we'd leave on the world, how people would remember us. Victoria was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with memory. He thought he'd be remembered for his courage in the war. Instead, he's remembered for bringing 2 lonely people together. Is that enough? For him? I think it would be more than enough. Victoria leaned against Bear's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For us, I think our legacy will be what we build. This community, the peace we help maintain, the example we set for what's possible when good people refuse to give up on each other. Bear nodded slowly. The man who'd once thought his capacity for violence made him unfit for civilized society had learned something important over the past months. Violence was simply a tool, no more inherently evil than a hammer or a plow. What mattered was how it was used, and by whom, and for what purpose. Martha Morrison told me something interesting today, Victoria said. 3 more families are moving to Cedar Ridge next month, including a doctor and a school teacher. Word is spreading that this is a safe place to build a life. And what do you think about that? I think Thomas would be proud, Victoria replied simply. He always believed that individual actions could change the world, one person at a time. We're proof he was right. As full darkness settled over the mountains, they went inside to the warmth of their cabin. Victoria pulled out her leather journal, the same one she'd written in for 15 years, and opened it to a fresh page. Dear Thomas, it's been 6 months since Jacob and I were married, and I wanted you to know that your faith in both of us was justified. The man you chose for me has become everything you said he would be. Strong when strength is needed, gentle when gentleness serves better, and wise enough to know the difference. We're building something here, Thomas. Not just a marriage, but a community. A place where people can find the second chances that this harsh country so rarely offers. Jacob has become the kind of lawman you would have been proud to serve under. And I've discovered that I'm much happier building something new than I ever was managing something inherited. I think about you every day, but the grief doesn't consume me anymore. Instead, it reminds me to be grateful for what I have, to cherish the time given to me, and to never take for granted the love of a good man, your sister. And Jacob's wife, Victoria McKenna. She closed the journal. Bear emerged from the bedroom with something in his hands, a small wooden carving of two figures standing together, their faces turned toward a distant horizon. "Wedding present?" Victoria asked, admiring the craftsmanship. "More like a promise," Bear replied, setting the carving on the mantelpiece where it caught the firelight. "I carved it during my first week as marshal, when I realized I was never going to be that solitary mountain man again." Victoria studied the little sculpture, a man and woman, hands joined, facing whatever came next together. It was crude compared to professional artwork, but it captured something essential about their partnership. Their shared commitment to building something lasting from the raw materials of hope and determination. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Outside their cabin, the Colorado wind sang through the pines with the voice of endless possibility. The territory was still wild, still dangerous, still full of men like the Dalton gang who chose violence over virtue. But it was also full of people like the citizens of Cedar Ridge, who'd learned that sometimes good folks could make a stand and win. In the morning, Marshal Jacob McKenna would pin on his badge and ride out to face whatever threats emerged from the vast frontier. Victoria McKenna would return to town to manage their business and help newcomers find their place in the growing community. They would face the challenges separately but carry the strength of their partnership with them wherever they went. The forged marriage certificate that had brought them together was long since replaced by genuine legal bonds. But the real certificate of their union was something deeper, the shared understanding that some promises are worth keeping even when they take 20 years to fulfill, and that some loves are strong enough to bridge any gap, whether measured in miles or years, or the terrible distances between lonely hearts. Thomas Ashworth's vision had been vindicated at last. Two people who might never have found each other had discovered that they were stronger together than either had ever been alone. In a harsh land that often rewarded selfishness and brutality, they had chosen to build something based on kindness, justice, and the radical notion that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. It was a legacy worth living for, and if necessary, worth dying for. But more importantly, it was a legacy worth building day by day, choice by choice, in the endless work of turning wilderness into home.